The Sunday school lesson for June 29th, 2025 is Jacob sets up a sacred pillar. Genesis chapter 26, verses 24 through 33. Welcome, viewers and subscribers, to my channel, The Backstory and More. I am Audrey. If you are new here, please know that this is an audio reading of the lesson with intermittent commentary. Also, I need everyone's help, especially those of you who have not subscribed to the channel. In order to stay in with the YouTube algorithm, I need you guys to subscribe, comment, like, or share the video. Thank you so much for all that you do to help this channel grow, one viewer and one subscriber at a time. Verse 10, Jacob left Beersheba and set out for Haran. Beersheba, a town in southern Canaan, was where Jacob's father Isaac eventually settled, following a series of disputes with the Philistines over the ownership of certain wells. Expressions regarding the distance between Dan and Beersheba are used 10 times in the Old Testament to mark the extremes of Israel's boundaries north to south. Jacob's destination of Haran is where Jacob's grandfather Abraham, named Abram at the time, lived before he left for Canaan. A journey from Beersheba to Haran, where Jacob's relatives still lived, was about 550 miles. Walking at a pace of 2 miles per hour would require a trip that would have taken over a month to complete. Verse 11, when he reached a certain place, he stopped for the night because the sun had set. The name of this certain place where Jacob stopped for the night is the town of Luz. It was about 60 miles north of Beersheba, so it took Jacob a few days to reach that point in his journey. With no street lights or flashlights available to illuminate the way, travelers of that era had to stop when the sun had set. Even if the moon were full, continuing onward would be problematic. Taking one of the stones there, he put it under his head and lay down to sleep. We may wonder how Jacob got much sleep with stones for his pillows. We will understand the significance of this later in today's lesson. And this will be no ordinary night of sleep in any case. Verse 12, he had a dream in which he saw a stairway resting on the earth with its top reaching to heaven, and the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. Jacob's dream is either the second or third dream mentioned in Genesis. Another dream, explicitly labeled as such, is in Genesis chapter 20, verses 3 through 7. There is a potential dream in chapter 15, verses 12 through 16, although the terms dream or dreamed are not explicitly used. Dreams initiated by God become very important in the remainder of Genesis. They involve Jacob, Laban, and people in the days of Joseph. The exact meaning of the word translated as stairway is not clear. Because this Hebrew word appears only once in the Old Testament, there are no other instances for comparison. Some students propose that it is something like an ancient ziggurat, a building that resembles a pyramid and includes steps that reach a platform at the top. An altar or shrine may be there, used by pagan worshippers for sacrifices or other religious rituals. What he sees on it is probably more captivating to Jacob than the structure. Angels are God's messengers. That description fits well with the fact that they are ascending and descending to take God's message to the earth. Angels would play an important part in the account of Jacob's life, particularly from the standpoint of his spiritual pilgrimage. Verse 13, there above it stood the Lord, and he said, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham, and the God of Isaac. I will give you and your descendants the land on which you are lying. At least one ziggurat was built for a pagan god to descend from heaven to earth to receive offerings and prayers from the people. What Jacob sees, however, is different. Above the structure stood the Lord, making no move to descend. Neither does God send one of the angels to deliver his message, he does it personally. From that position of authority, God began with a self introduction. He made a promise regarding the land and Jacob's descendants. The fact that the land would be given to Jacob's descendants meant he would have a wife and at least one child. Such an affirmation was likely intended to provide, among other things, much needed assurance to Jacob. After all, he was leaving the territory of the land of promise on his way to Haran, the exact reverse of the trip Abraham took. We may wonder why God applied the word father to Abraham instead of to Isaac, since Abraham was Jacob's grandfather. The issue is resolved when we realize that the word father is used in the Bible also to describe ancestor, as in forefather. As the Lord spoke to Jacob, there is no record that he said anything about Jacob's deceptive actions toward his father and brother. Instead, God reaffirmed Jacob's position in the lineage of covenant promises made to his forefathers. Verse 14, excuse me, verse 14, your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west and to the east, to the north and to the south. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you and your offspring. The Lord clarified the extent of the promise regarding Jacob's descendants in both a physical and a spiritual sense. God had used the phrase like the dust of the earth before when Abraham was promised all the land he could see. Jacob may have heard about this from his grandfather, for Jacob was age 15 when Abraham died. The portion of the message regarding the blessing for all peoples on earth was initially mentioned in Genesis chapter 12, verse 3. That was when Abraham was leaving Haran, the place toward which Jacob was headed. This part of the message is, therefore, not a new element either. It had been God's stated plan all along, but it bore repeating. Verse 15, I am with you and will watch over you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. God's promise, I am with you, is one of the most reassuring statements in Scripture. For Jacob, these words provided encouragement as he embarked on life as a fugitive sojourner. Although he was moving away from the land promised to his grandfather and father, he was not moving away from the presence or protection of God. In pagan thinking, gods were local, not global. They were limited to the territory or country they supposedly ruled. But finding a place outside of God's jurisdiction is impossible. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. The word until does not imply that the Lord would abandon Jacob at some future date. Since the promise was that Jacob's descendants would bless all nations, and that blessing was ongoing, it must be that God will always be present. God works constantly to bring humanity to the position and place we need to be. Verse 16. When Jacob awoke from his sleep, he thought, surely the Lord is in this place, and I was not aware of it. Jacob seemed to have awakened as soon as the dream ended, while it was yet night. His amazement that the Lord is in this place was probably because the spot seemed very ordinary. There appeared to be nothing especially holy about it. Jacob learned that God could make the most ordinary location holy by his presence. Moses will realize the same truth in his day, centuries later. Verse 17, he was afraid and said, how awesome is this place! This is none other than the house of God. This is the gate of heaven. Fear kicked in. The word translated awesome is derived from the same Hebrew word as the one translated afraid. The word said indicates that Jacob expressed his anxiety out loud, although he was alone. There is no indication that Jacob desired or expected an in person discussion with God, but he got one anyway. The phrase, the house of God, is considered in Genesis 28, verse 19. Verse 18. Early the next morning, Jacob took the stone he had placed under his head and set it up as a pillar. Standing stones were common in the ancient world. In Canaan, such objects were the focus of pagan worship at open air sanctuaries, as archaeological excavations at various sites have revealed them. Because of this idolatrous use, some suggest that Jacob's action in the verse before us conflict with what Moses stressed in Leviticus chapter 26 verse 1 centuries later, that the people of Israel were not to set up sacred images or stones, for the Lord hated them. Later, Israel was instructed to smash the stones of the Canaanites. The resolution of this supposed conflict is simple. If an erected stone involved the worship of other gods, then the Lord's commands applied. However, a stone erected as a memorial was an entirely different matter. As we continue, verse 18 continues, and poured oil on top of it. The oil Jacob poured on the top of the memorial stone served to consecrate it. Oil was often used to anoint priests and kings, but oil would also be used on objects. Verse 19, he called that place Bethel, though the city used to be called Luz. The Hebrew word Bethel means house of God. This reflects Jacob's declaration in Genesis chapter 28, verse 17. Bethel is one of the most mentioned places in the Old Testament. The identifier is used dozens of times. It is a key location and reference point in the history of Israel. Negatively, Bethel became the site where Jeroboam, the first king of the northern kingdom of divided Israel, built one of his golden calf idols to keep the people from going to Jerusalem to worship at the temple there. That was about 930 BC, sometime 10 centuries after the time of Jacob. Bethel's idolatrous altar would remain for some 3 centuries until destroyed by godly King Josiah. Archaeologists, archaeologists have not been able to determine the location of Bethel with certainty. A majority identified the location with a village known today as Bethel. A minority viewpoint is that Bethel is to be identified with the modern village of El Bira, just to the north of Bethel. Verses 20 through 22. Then Jacob made a vow, saying, if God will be with me and will watch over me on this journey I am taking, and will give me food to eat and clothes to wear, so that I return safely to my father's household, then the Lord will be my God, and this stone that I have set up as a pillar will be God's house. And of all that you give me, I will give you a tenth. Jacob's vow presupposes his confidence in God's promises. We should not overinterpret his word if to mean he was unsure. His words clarify, at least to his own mind, the tangible takeaways of God's presence. Even on his dangerous journey to a distant place and the long years of his sojourn there, he can rest assured that somehow he will come home. He will not become a casualty on the long roads to Haran and back. Jacob's vow ought to be seen as distinct from those promises made to God during moments of crisis or emergency. This vow was based on what God had revealed would be provided to him. We also remember that this vow was coming from someone who was just beginning to understand what trusting in God meant. Jacob had a lengthy journey ahead of him, both in terms of physical miles and spiritual maturity. When Jacob promised, "Then the Lord will be my God," he was, in a sense, acknowledging that his relationship with the Lord would be far deeper than what it was at that time. Jacob's financial holdings were negligible as he made this vow. He only had what was with him. But if Jacob were ever able to return to his father's house, then Jacob would do his best to fulfill his sincere desires to make this place God's house and to give the tenth of all he had. Typically, this verse is interpreted in terms of what Jacob amassed during his time away, but he did not know of any future wealth at this point. In later Israelite practice, tithes were collected for temple support and feeding poor and vulnerable people. The giver also ate and shared parts of the tithe of fruit, crops, and meat, sharing them with others as a sign of gratitude for God's bounty. How was Jacob to distribute his tithes? The text does not say. The story may show him as a model for future Israelites who would have both a mechanism and a purpose for redistributing their tithes. Thank you so much for listening, and please consider subscribing to the channel. Stay safe and may God bless.